位同事，大家好。咁時間到啦。咁首先呢，就我哋係要選主席嘅。咁而家係首先進行2016年強制性公積金計劃修訂條例生效日期公告小組委員會主席嘅選舉。咁根據載於內務守則第22條及附錄4嘅選舉程序呢，而家係請委員提名主席一職嘅人選。有黃定光議員、
林健鋒議員。
我接受。陳，
我和議或者邊個和議冇所謂
嘅。蔣麗芸議員和議，有冇其他提名？咁或者我應該請，唔係，你要上嚟
唔使啦啩？仲有冇其他提議？
有冇其他提議？
就無謂調嚟調去啦。
OK。咁多謝各位。有冇需要選副主席？
唔係啊嘛？
唔係，我程序係要咁樣。
冇需要。
冇 OK。咁多謝各位。咁我哋而家就進入去今日嘅議程。咁首先請政府嘅官員入嚟。或者趁佢哋未入嚟嗰陣時咧，我講講有關今日呢個條例。咁主要咧就係生效日期嗰個背景同埋資料啦。咁財經事務及庫務局局長咧就喺2016年10月14號就發出咗一份函件，咁大家都有喺手嚟㗎啦。咁另外法律事務部嘅報告同埋立法會秘書處擬備嘅背景資料簡介嘅文件，大家都有喺手嚟㗎啦。咁或者我首先請政府當局咧，就介紹一下有關呢份文件，咁然後咧就請委員咧發問。咁我首先咧就係介紹有今日到嚟參加呢個會議嘅有關官員，佢哋係張國財先生，佢係財經事務及庫務局嘅副秘書長。另外亦都有鍾韻妮女士，佢係局嘅助理秘書長。咁另外呢，就有馬成信先生，佢係強積金計劃管理局嘅規劃及政策總監同埋執行董事。另外亦都有強積金計劃管理局嘅主管余家寶女士，強積金計劃嘅管理局嘅主管姚尚敏女士，咁亦都有政府嘅律政司高級政府律師黎啟鵬先生，歡迎各位。咁或者首先請副秘書長介紹一下今日有關嘅文件，好嗎？
一個法例呢，就係關於強積金嘅預設投資策略嘅。咁其實呢個法例呢，就喺上一屆立法會係今年嘅5月份呢已經係通過咗嘅。咁而今次我哋講呢，就係話佢幾時實施嘅。咁呢個係一個關於實施日期嘅一個附屬法例。咁因為我都知悉呢，就呢個委員會入邊呢係有一啲新嘅立法會委員，立法會議員，咁所以呢，我哋都準備咗一個即係投影片呢，就係詳細解釋翻呢一個法例。雖然佢已經通過咗呢個法例，關於預設投資策略嘅一啲安排嘅。咁我而家先請呢，就係強積金管理局嘅馬成信先生為我哋做一個呢個投影片嘅介紹。
Darren, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Let me take members briefly through a little bit of the background as to how we get to this point. As Mr Chung has said, the legislation has already been discussed, but I'll take you through some of the background as to how we get here. The starting premise is that within MPF, members do have choices about how they can invest their benefits, but many members don't. Many members don't want to or they can't. And so each scheme has to have rules about what happens in that case when members don't do it. At the moment, this isn't regulated at all. So this has been left to individual providers to make up their own rules, in essence. We're not the only place in the world that does this, but that's the background as to how that happened. As a consequence, as you can see from this slide, different schemes come up with different answers. So some used mixed asset funds, which might have a higher risk exposure. Some use conservative funds. Some use a range of things. In a couple of cases, they just spread the benefits across all the funds in the scheme. Now, no matter what view one takes about what's the right approach, the fact that there are this variety of approaches across similar schemes just can't be the right approach. So that was the basis upon which this project started, that we needed some consistency in that approach to deal with this choice complexity issue. There's been a long developmental process in this, including a public consultation back in 2014, through to introduction of the legislation by the end of 15, and as Mr Chung said, the passage of the bill as recently as May. The proposed implementation date, which is the objective of this committee, being the 1st of April 2017. So what the legislation does, it requires every trustee to do the same thing, basically. As I said, to date, they do different things. So the objective of this is just to get them to do the same thing. So there are some provisions in the amendment ordinance which require the trustees to provide this standardised thing, and importantly, this standardised approach has a fee control. And the name we provide for this, because it applies to those who don't make the decision themselves, is the default investment strategy. So it's a strategy that applies to the contributions from those who don't give instructions. So this has an impact, it's true, on the accounts of many scheme members. This slide seeks to give you an idea of how this affects different types of members. On the whole, for most members who've already given instructions in relation to their accounts, this has no impact on them whatsoever, and that is the vast majority of members, the vast majority of accounts, and the vast majority of money in the system. So this focuses on going forward. To take the second point there, for new members coming in, the impact of this starting on the 1st of April is that from a new member coming in on that day, setting up a new account, if they don't give instructions, then obviously, as a default, the investments will go into the DIS. That's the whole premise of the new law. So that's relatively simple. There are some transitional provisions about what happens to current accounts. You know, the new world is always easy. In these types of movements, it's the transitional provisions which do have some complexity. So the legislation does provide some transitional provisions about how this affects existing scheme members. Obviously, as I said, this only affects those existing scheme members who have not given instructions for any of the benefits in their account. And for those types of accounts, there's a process by which they'll be moved into the default investment strategy over time. And I'll speak a little bit more about that process in a minute. As I said, for the most members who've given their instructions, the actual commencement on the 1st of April would not affect them. But of course, they have the option to choose to invest in the default investment strategy from that date. So they can give new instructions at any point in time from that date to invest their existing or future benefits in this new default investment strategy. So it has slightly different impacts on different members as subject to how they integrate with the system at the moment. But the simplest case is new members from 1st April, unless they give instructions or until they give instructions, then their contributions will go into the default investment strategy. A large part of the law, and more of the technical part of the development, which took a long time to work through with the industry, and we discussed that some length with members through the Bills Committee process, was if you're going to have a standardised approach, well, what is the standardised investment approach? So a lot of the legislative provisions go to how this actually is invested, and that is set out in some detail. And there are a couple of principles there. Firstly, that we're going to achieve the most diversification benefits that we can. So the benefits in this strategy will be invested in a diversified manner. And importantly, because we need to deal with, in an average sense, how we best protect members, the real risk in long-term investment is what happens right at the end. And the analysis we did showed that this is where members can really get hurt if things go bad right at the end. So the law provides for reducing exposure to higher risk assets as a member gets older. The mechanism we do that is a little bit complicated, but in essence the way we've done it is to as little change as possible. So we need 2 new constituent funds. As members may know, a MPF scheme has got a number of investment options, anywhere from 5 to 20 on a typical scheme, and these are called constituent funds. So we need 2 constituent funds to achieve the de-risking and strategy I just mentioned. The way it works is that up until age 50, a member's contributions to the DIS will be invested wholly in this constituent fund called the Core Accumulation Fund. And the pink bit there represents the risky assets in that particular constituent fund. So 60% of that fund is invested in riskier assets, that means equities and shares, and 40% invested in lower assets, lower risk assets. In contrast, when you get to the end of the working life and to past the retirement age, or claim age as it's called, the investment approach is we've taken the risk off the table by that stage. So there's a constituent fund called the Age 65 Plus Fund, which is only 20% equity. So that's much lower risk. And that's the fund that money will stay on from age 65, or technically actually age 64 in the way it works in the law. So we need a process for moving people from that age 50 to that age 65, and that's some of the technical aspects of the design of this. So we have all these steps in theory. How do we get people from one down to the other? The way we do it is to gradually move money out of the Core Accumulation Fund and put it into the age 65 fund. So between age 50 and 64, people will have some money in both of those funds, but each year the trustee, the member doesn't have to do anything, the trustee will automatically move some of the money out of the higher risk fund and put more in the lower risk fund. So at the end of that glide path, as we call it, from age 64 and 65 onwards, the member will be 100% invested in the lower risk fund, the age 65 plus fund. So that's the mechanism we've used and is set out in the law to achieve that de-risking. The other important element, as members know, is that the default investment strategy comes with fee and expense controls. This was an important part of dealing with members' concerns about the cost of their interaction with MPS providers. The fee control in the law as a starting point is 0.75 of the fund value each year. And this covers all of the payments for the services of the providers indicated on the right. So trustees, administrators do all the administration work, obviously. There's also investment managers who do a totally different function. The investment work also falls within that. The work that the sponsors and promoters do in establishing and promoting and distributing the scheme, custodians on the whole, and the same types of funds that are charged to lower level funds are included in the rather complex calculation. We provided guidelines as to how to apportion these across the CF level and underlying fund level, because we don't want people just to be able to hide this at underlying funds. So the law specifically sets out a mechanism for uplifting the costs and fees at the lower level so that all of that is captured holistically in that 0.75% of net asset value each year. This is actually a daily cap set out in the law, but on an annual basis this works out at 0.75%. The other cap within the law is an expense control beyond fees, which are sort of a profit item or an item to cover the cost of providing the services from certain parties that I indicated on the previous slide. There are expenses. So there are things that come out of funds which are actual acquittals on the basis of a cost incurred. So these are incurred by the fund and include things like auditor's fee and lots of miscellaneous things, printing expenses, bank charges, government fees, and these are defined in the law. So these are subject to a different cap, which is also an annual cap of can't exceed more than 20 points, so 0.2% of the net asset value of the fund. So in combination, these are considered as important constraints on the way that fees and expenses will affect the returns of members in the default investment strategy. Considered important if we're designing defaults that they have to be able to provide good value to members, and it's the combination of those two proposals that achieve that. In terms of how that works for members, so at the end of the day there's this new thing, the default investment strategy for people who don't make choices, but the law also requires that the default investment strategy itself is a choice. So people can choose that. So this becomes a new choice option for people as well, for those who want to make choices, and they can decide, for instance, to consciously choose to invest 100% in the default investment strategy, or they still preserve all their other rights to choose other constituent funds. So they can choose above or below the line. If they want to put part of the money in a variety of funds, they can do so, including the two new funds, the two constituent funds I mentioned that are part of the default investment strategy. So members will be able to allocate their investment choice across the range of constituent funds, including those two new ones. So that's, in effect, a new range of choice available for members beyond the ability just to invest everything in this fund. And if they don't want to make any choice, well, that's exactly what this is designed for. They'll end up in the default investment strategy. So the implement timeframe for this, and this looks a little bit to the transition. So how do we deal with this complex issue of those current accounts where there are no instructions? On the assumption that this commences in April 2017, the law sets out a transitional period as to how this works. Within that 6 months, the affected accounts will get a notice from the trustees. It's the trustees' job to identify these accounts and to send out a notice to all of these accounts within that first 6 months. The member then has 42 days, and what the notice says is that unless I hear from you in the next 42 days, this account will be invested in the default investment strategy going forward. So that's what the notice says. So the member has that 42 days to get back to the trustee and say, no, I want to do something else. Up to this point they've done nothing, but this is a fresh opportunity for them to make a decision. They could make that decision any time from today, in essence. They can give instructions to the trustee and fall outside that provision. But this is for those who've not, by the time the notices are sent out, made any choice. They get the notice and they've got 42 days to get back to the trustee. If they do not get back, then the obligation on the trustee is within the next 14 days to invest that account in accordance with the default investment strategy. So for someone under 50, that means they put all the money into the core accumulation fund. Someone between 50 to 65, they'd invest it in accordance with the allocations I mentioned in one of the previous slides. So the trustee will do all that for the member. The member doesn't have to do anything. This is about relieving the burden from the member of having to work through that. There are a couple of exceptions to that, and we discussed some of these at length in Bill's committee previously. That transitional requirement about these are accounts that have got no instructions and are wholly invested in the current default, that will not apply to members who are over 60 on commencement date, so on the 1st of April. And the reason for that being there seemed little point in changing their asset allocation when they're so close to being able to withdraw the benefits from the system. The second category, who will get the notice, but there's a special rule about those who are currently invested in guarantee funds. We do not want them to be denied the benefit of the promise contained in the guarantee, so the trustee has to do some work to work out whether the member would be better off, whether the guarantee has value, and if the guarantee has value, the member stays in the guarantee fund, and the actual requirements on the trustee are set out in the law. So they're set out. In terms of regulation and supervision, of course, the bill also sets out provisions about extending the MPFA's powers in relation to supervision and regulation if there's any failure to comply. So our existing powers are extended to the DIS, as well as some new provisions. There's provisions for auditors and service providers to report any non-compliance to the authority, and the authority can actually request auditors' investigation and report in relation to any concerns that we might have. The law also sets out the consequences if there's failure to comply with any of these obligations, and there's lots of obligations in there on trustees. The consequences being the possibilities of revocation as an approved trustee in the most serious cases, suspension or termination of scheme administration, and also a range of financial penalties that can apply for trustee failure to comply with the obligations. So in terms of the process of this committee, the commencement notice was tabled on the 19th of October with a target of commencing the legislation on the 1st of April 2017. Of course, since the passage of the bill, the authority and the industry has been actively involved in trying to educate members and make them more aware of this thing that is coming, because it's a big change. Up to this point, the authority has been engaged in one particular campaign. We split this into 3 particular phases. The first part being from June to November, sort of a preparatory campaign to get people interested enough to perhaps go and check what their current status is, so they're not surprised about what may happen next year in relation to their account. So we've engaged in advertisements in newspapers and websites to remind members that this is coming, that it'll have an impact on them, and to encourage them to check with the trustees, because that's where they have to go, to check with the trustees that their address is up to date, for instance, so that they will get the important communication which will come very shortly. The next phase will be a larger scale campaign once there is a clear commencement date and that is passed. Then we will start a campaign in a little more detail about the features of the DIS to let people know what's coming and to remind them that they will be getting important notices. And importantly, they will get something in all likelihood before the end of the year, because the amendments to all the documentation will be sent to members along with a detailed notice about the impact on their account. And the third phase, of course, will be after this commences. The authority, with the support of the industry, will commence a large-scale publicity campaign, again emphasising the details of the DIS, its implementation, and importantly reminding people, for those who will be affected, you will get this transitional notice sometime in the next 6 months, and reminding them of how important that is to them and the action required of members both in advance of that and after they receive that notice. Chairman, we have some of the publicity material here if members are interested. I won't take members through them individually, but of course we will have a range of newspaper, online and search engine based advertisements. We have a dedicated web page on our website dealing specifically with DIS issues as they develop. The focus at the moment is, as I said, encouraging members to be involved enough to perhaps check their account status and make sure that the trustee has their contact details so they can receive the important communication to come. There have been specific activities around certain types of accounts. Casual employees under the industry schemes have a different set of issues. Many of those accounts didn't have as much contact information as master trust accounts, so we have specific campaigns related to that, and there have been some specific activities around high publicity events such as horse racing opportunities to remind those people that they should check that they are aware of their accounts and their contact details are up to date. And this continues the theme of emphasising for those industry scheme casual employees and assisting them to make sure that they are within contact of their trustee and they're interested in what's happening to their account, including a mobile text message to all employees in the construction industry. So there's a variety of strategies adopted to make sure people know what's happening and what's coming in that respect. Chairman, that brings us up to date with preparation to date, and we're happy, of course, to take members' questions.
Thank you, Darren. 我都想首先同委員講講啦，有關文件嘅內容咧，其實係響上一屆6月嗰陣時咧已經係通過咗㗎啦。咁今個呢個委員會要處理嘅咧就係呢個立法程序嘅時間表。咁咧主要係有3個日期嘅，就係審議期屆滿嘅日期，同埋向內會內務委員會報告嘅日期，同埋就動議修訂附屬法例作出預告嘅限期。咁雖然係已經討論咗、通過咗，咁但係基於我哋今屆咧係有一啲新委員嘅，咁所以咧我都睇下委員有啲咩問題咧，就因為有啲官員喺度咧，即係大家都可以問一問。咁首先係陸頌雄議員。
多謝主席。咁我哋
或者我讀一讀啦。陳健波，跟住係陳健波議員、張超雄議員、潘兆平議員同埋周浩鼎議員。陸議員。
多謝主席。咁我哋工聯會一直都好關注即係強積金嘅回報啊，各方面嘅嘢，同埋收費問題。咁啊就住咧呢個 嘅條例呢，其實我哋喺上一屆呢都提出過一啲嘅修訂，咁就遺憾呢未能夠通過嘅。但係都希望呢喺新一屆呢，我哋繼續呢係關注嗰個回報嘅管制啦，係咪會有啲機制？即係如果嗰個回報係低於某個水平，譬如可能係用一個通脹做指標，咁應該有啲懲罰下，可能係扣減嗰個管理費啊，甚至乎係咪要研究佢嗰個受託人嘅資格呢？咁同埋嗰個收費呢，7.5% 加2% 呢，好多市民都覺得係仍然未夠低嘅。咁是否呢會定一個即係檢討嘅機制呢？最好梗係1年1檢啦，係咪？咁同埋透明度方面呢，我覺得而家積金局呢喺嗰個投資回報嗰方面呢，俾公眾嘅信息呢係唔夠嘅。譬如嗰個國家嘅受託人嘅基金嘅回報嘅排名啦。有係嘅情況係點樣呢？仲有呢，都想問一個好具體嘅問題，就係積金局有冇估計呢？而家即係用而家嘅情況係冇做投資指示嘅比例有幾多？咁如果實施咗呢條新例之後呢，自動撥入呢個預設基金嘅又有幾多？咁仲有一個呢，就係嗰個宣傳教育嗰方面呢。我覺得呢個新嘅即係條例實施咗之後呢，對成個強積金嘅市場呢轉變都係相當之大嘅。特別係除咗一啲呢，即係冇指示嘅自動撥咗落呢個預設基金嗰度啦嚇。其實呢，如果你話佢中間嗰個叫做係核心累積基金，其實佢嗰個投資組合咧都幾似以往一啲基金裏邊嘅中度風險嘅投資組合嘅嘢嚟嘅。咁但係以前呢，可能1.5% 或者係更高嘅管理費，咁呢個相對平嘅。咁對於可能係即係投資者嚟講咧係有利嘅。咁呢方面呢，其實都係值得去宣傳推廣。因為如果咪有啲人呢，就係以為我冇選擇呢。即係或者我冇落嗰個投資指示呢，先至會跌落去嘅啫。呢度可能呢會有啲公眾嘅誤解，所以亦都要加強嗰個宣傳教育咯。唔該，主席。
好，邊位回應？
或者我簡單回應啦。如果有需要，我可以請馬成信先生呢去補充嘅。主席，咁係的確嘅。喺討論呢個條例嗰個法案委員會嗰陣時呢，即係工聯會都提出好多嘅意見。咁不過必須強調呢，就係回報呢，的確係一啲未知數嚟嘅。咁如果係因為一啲未知數呢，而去作出一啲罰則呢，我哋覺得係並不適合嘅。即係我哋嗰陣時做一個比喻，就係我哋冇可能話要即係個天文台好準確，真係預測天氣嘅，即係一定係有啲落差嘅。咁但係當然我哋係明白呢，回報呢係一啲計劃成員呢係好希望知道嘅嘢。咁其實呢，積金局呢係有個平台，佢係將每一個強積金嗰個基金呢嗰個回報呢係1年啊、3年啊、5年啊、10年啊嗰個年化率嗰個回報呢，其實係有喺度嘅。咁啲委員呢。啲成員呢係可以好容易呢去上呢個網上嘅平台呢作出個比較嘅。咁我亦都好樂意呢係再做多啲宣傳呢，係等啲成員呢係可以知道點樣用呢個平台去比較一啲回報嘅。咁我哋亦都係承諾咗呢係3年實行咗呢一個預設投資策略之後嘅3年呢，就會嚟立法會即係會匯報一下啦，即係我哋嗰個檢討嘅。咁點解係3年呢？就因為我哋講緊呢一啲比較長線嘅投資啊。咁我哋就唔想即係淨係依賴譬如1年嘅一個數據呢，就作出一個即係武斷嘅一個結論。咁所以我哋覺得即係3年之後呢，先做一個檢討呢，佢會比較適合。咁當然啦，我哋可以不斷即係同立法會嘅議員呢，係即係定期呢，我哋去即係匯報一下嗰個成效啊，各樣嘢嘅執行嗰個成效咁。咁我好贊成啊頭先陸議員提嗰度嘅，因為我哋有呢個收費管制呢，其實我哋第一次。咁我哋亦都頭先馬成信先生嗰個介紹呢，就睇到呢一個計劃成員呢，佢係唔需要揀呢個預設投資計劃嘅，佢仲有一個選擇呢，係可以直接呢係揀呢個有收費管制嘅累積基金或者個60歲後嘅基金嘅。咁所以呢，如果一個成員佢覺得就係話我自己都識做呢啲咁嘅風險調整嘅，但係我又想呢係受惠於呢一個咁嘅收費管制喎，咁所以我咪自己可以作出一個決定去揀 呢一個有收費管制嘅累積基金係完全可以做。咁我哋係完全同意阿陸議員嘅説法，我哋應該係會做多啲宣傳嘅。
OK， 唔該 Eddie。跟住係請陳健波議員。
主席，保險界咧都係做呢個強積金嘅機構，都喺呢個法案委員會都講咗好多啦。主要就係話嗰個擔心咧係，如果市民唔了解呢個對佢哋影響咧，就冇選擇呢個退出嘅話咧，結果就會有後果，就係話將來好多年後會翻嚟，喂，點解將我啲錢搬晒去一啲由以前可能佢係好低風險嘅，轉去高風險嘅？咁我哋當然係建議選擇加入嘅，即係如果佢係覺得佢需要轉去呢個要呢個預設投資策略嘅咧，佢就選擇加入。咁但係當然我哋要個結果就大家投票都覺得話係可以容許係呢個選擇退出啦。咁我哋覺得呢個唔理想嘅，咁大家都冇辦法啦，因為而家大家都決定咗咁做啦。咁所以就好依賴嗰個宣傳教育工作啦。咁我而家睇到你呢度亦都有即係相當多嘅資源或者個計劃咧，係做呢個宣傳教育工作啦。不過我希望你嗰個宣傳嘅重點咧都要講咧，就係話如果嗰個基金或者強積金嘅成員咧，如果佢喺收到個通知42日之內係一定要回覆嘅，即係希望你嗰個宣傳嗰個重點一個最重要就係話俾一定要回覆，你唔回覆咧，嗰啲錢咧就會去咗呢個核心基金啦。即係我諗佢要呢個重點一定要出到啦，就唔好出咗其他啲話咩重唔重要或者其他嘢。最緊要都係要講俾佢聽咧，如果佢喺嗰42天之內唔回覆咧，嗰個機構咧，佢結果就會將啲錢自動轉去呢一啲核心基金啦。咁就當然根據個歲數，就嗰個風險會當然係不斷咁減少啦嚇。咁但係都始終係一個比較即係進取啲嘅投資策略。咁所以希望咧就係第一政府即係或者係強積金局咧喺呢個宣傳嘅內容嗰度咧，一定要有呢個重點出到嚟先得嚇。呢個第一啦。第二咧都想問一問，究竟業界準備好未咧？因為你而家話係4月1號開始啊，咁我想問一問政府咧，同呢個強積金嗰啲服務提供者嗰個溝通啊，佢哋嘅電腦又做成點啊？佢哋嗰啲人手又做成點？我想你講一講呢樣嘢。
Eddie。
係主席多謝陳議員嘅提問。咁我哋係同業界係有個商討，咁係業界係有信心咧，係喺4月1號咧係準備就緒嘅。
咁頭先嗰個宣傳策略嗰啲，
係主席多謝陳議員嘅意見，我哋會即係參考呢個意見，我哋會即係個重點都係各方面啦。呢個係一個好好嘅意見，我哋一定會接受嘅。
我諗陳議員提出嗰點響宣傳嗰方面，或者甚至到教育嗰方面咧，應該要做多啲唔多嘅。過去有一啲條例出嚟咧，好多人都有好多問題，就係響嗰個條例生效之後嘅。咁如果係由而家去到4月1號咧，係做多呢一方面嘅工作咧，我諗對各方面都係有好處嘅嚇。跟住落嚟係請張超雄議員。
主席，當然即係呢個預設投資策略，我哋係歡迎嘅。雖然佢未盡完善，包括咗即係所收嘅一啲費用或者開支咧，其實都有空間去繼續下降。如果我哋淨係睇盈富基金咧，其實佢嗰個費用咧就仍然遠遠低過呢一個即係收費嘅或者開支嘅上限嘅。咁但係即係點都好啦，我都想理解一下。就住呢一個機制咧，其實我唔知道當局有冇做過啲模擬嘅預測，即係話用翻呢一個投資策略咧，係或者有高中低嘅一啲嘅唔同嘅情況底下咧，大概每年即係以過去嗰一段時間，可能過去嗰5年10年，呢個收費同埋嗰個開支，即係嗰個 return 嗰個叫回報啊，大概係幾多啦？同埋而家嗰個管理費用0.75% 咧，同埋個開支0.2% 咧，相對於現有喺市場上面嘅貨品嚟講咧，即係究竟係已經係屬於低到幾多咧？係咪最低咧？即係個 percentile 啦，即係我唔知中文係叫咩，屬於係幾多咧？咁樣可唔可以都同我哋講講呢啲
？Darren?
Thank you. Chairman, let me try to answer those questions. We agree there's room for lowering fees. These need to be established, and as Mr Chung has said, that needs to be reviewed going forward. your question of the fees and the FER, yes, FER has come down. 2007, when these figures were first available, the average expense ratio figure was 2.1. That's now 1.56. So that figure has dropped about a quarter in that period. But yes, that figure is still well above the figure one gets to if you extrapolate from the two caps here. I should say those, if you add up the 0.75 and 0.2, that does not necessarily exactly equal an FER figure. Let me emphasise that so we manage the expectations going forward, but it should approximate it. So on the whole, that's broadly in the park. So yes, these funds will be significantly lower than the average. They're also lower than the vast majority of funds. We do have some low fee funds at the moment, but these new funds will all be well below the benchmark for getting onto that list. So that is important. In terms of the tracker fund, your observation is correct. The tracker fund's management expense ratio, which is calculated quite differently to our fund expense ratio, is very low, perhaps 20 basis points or lower. But that only represents the investment management component. It's to be remembered that the largest part of that 75 doesn't relate to investment management. It relates to the administration of the MPF scheme, which is quite different to administering just an exchange-traded fund. You may remember we used a consultant to do some work on estimating the cost of administration a few years ago. Ernst & Young's report calculated that the cost of administration, ignoring that investment part, was 75 points, which suggests that the 75 is quite an aggressive, because it does include the investment costs of things like tracker. We're still looking at the applications coming in, but many of them are adopting a passive index-based approach. So as far as the investment part goes, yes, we'd be expecting some of the investment costs to be getting down towards those sorts of ranges. And there are some larger providers of index-type strategies who are interested in working with our trustees. So we're excited about the possibility of getting those costs down quite dramatically as part of this implementation. The scenario analysis, I'll give you a very long answer on this, but I'll try to be brief. We did a lot of work, and we had retained a consultant from the OECD to work with us on doing scenario analysis of different investment strategies. To cut a long story short, yes, you get a huge dispersion of returns depending on your strategy. To take the tracker fund, of course, the average would have been higher, but as Hong Kong equities, we would have left a lot of people with very bad outcomes at the end because of the volatility. And we also modelled pure cash and everything in between. The approach we got to at the end through his work and working with the industry and our observations about how others are doing this around the world is the strategy we have. Overall equity exposure in the low 50s between those two funds, so about 53%. But importantly, to remove that tail risk of things going really wrong at the end is the scenario that he worked on. And so the de-risking that we do 15 years from the end is designed to deal with that and protect members from those bad outcomes.
好，我仲有一個跟進問題咧，就係關於而家我哋會通知啦，同埋有個公告日期之後咧，我留意到有好多即係有強積金嘅打工仔女咧，其實佢唔係好知自己而家個投資策略係點。究竟佢係咪已經擺咗喺預設投資策略啊？定係話擺咗喺啲咩基金咧？佢唔清楚。咁當然啦，如果你話新入嘅或者已經擺咗預設投資策略嘅，就自動轉帳落到呢個核心基金，咁呢個冇問題啊。但係嗰啲唔係嘅，佢可能唔知嘅。我就想問政府當局會唔會都要求而家嗰啲強積金嗰啲嘅管理公司咧，都俾一個通知俾所有嘅有強積金戶口嘅成員，讓佢哋可以用一個最簡單嘅方式去表示佢願意將佢自己嗰個投資咧轉為呢個新嘅預設投資策略，咁就會最方便啦。咁呢樣嘢咧就可以即係我哋而家明知呢一個嘅收費會比較係合理啦。同埋即係如果根據頭先所講嗰個做咗唔同嘅投資分析，亦都會覺得而家呢個分析咧，根據嗰個年齡咁樣分佈咧，係可能係一個最好嘅風險管理。 咁係咪即係應該更加讓所有嘅強積金嘅打工仔女容易啲進入呢一個咁樣嘅新嘅安排咧？
好，Eddie。
主席，多謝阿張議員嘅意見嘅。咁係我哋係會做嘅，因為點解呢？而家我哋講緊呢，就係話每一個受託人都要喺每一個強積金嘅計劃呢係加2個基金，因為呢個預設投資就有2個基金。咁所以呢，佢係必須呢係要發信俾所有嘅強積金成員呢，係通知佢將會有呢2個新嘅基金。咁而當我哋實施嗰陣時呢，就再會做一次呢，就係話俾一啲係從來冇做過投資決定嘅一啲成員，就係話希望你喺42日之內呢作出一個決定。咁如果你冇決定呢，我哋先會去轉嘅。咁亦都呢，我哋其實而家呢，強積金管理局呢已經係做咗好多宣傳。你哋可能都會喺報章留意到，就係你有冇收到強積金呢封信啊？咁呢一啲宣傳嘅，咁呢個宣傳呢，我完全同意議員呢係我哋個重中之重，係一個非常之重要嘅一個重點工作嚟嘅。多謝議員。
我想澄清，即係話咧，呢啲嘅受託人呢，將會有一個信息俾所有嘅戶口持有人，然後佢哋只要簡單顯示話佢願意將現有嘅佢嘅戶口嘅資金轉移到呢2個核心基金，或者跟呢個預設投資策略嘅話呢，咁就可以完成呢個工作㗎啦。係，但係就要4月1號先可以做呢個動作。係啦，多謝主席。
其實正話陳健波議員呢都提出過一個宣傳教育嗰個問題，咁大家都關心嘅。不論你係勞資或者係管理有關基金嘅公司呢，喺呢一方面都希望政府可以做多一啲宣傳。咁係咪可以除咗一啲傳統嘅宣傳方法，有一啲正話你話講話報紙，我覺得喺報章上邊個宣傳呢係咪真係咁大效力呢？因為而家好多人真係唔係睇報紙㗎嚇，咁呢個或者你去考慮一下。最重要嘅呢，就大家都知道有一個新制度喺度大家點樣可以去處理。咁至於嗰個管理費嗰度呢，我哋都明白到呢，就係基金嘅大小參加嘅人數呢係會影響到個收費嘅。但係參加者最重要嘅呢，就係你收費低回報高咁呢個呢，即係我都希望你哋一路落去呢都關注呢一點。跟住落嚟係請潘兆平議員。
多謝主席。呢個條例呢，就喺5月通過啦，咁我都支持嘅。咁當然啦，而家個實施日期就喺出年4月啦。咁其實我都同意，要加強嗰個宣傳，呢個係必要。咁其實我主要想問一個好簡單嘅問題，因為由呢個條例到而家已經半年啦。咁理論上咧就以往冇去選擇投資嗰啲僱員，其實佢都而家可以選擇翻自己應該要選擇。我想知道下有冇咩變動啊？即係有冇掌握到而家嗰個狀況之下，即係以前冇選擇嘅僱員佢哋有冇變動，會自己主動去選擇咗一啲嘅安排咧？唔該。
Darren or Eddie or Darren.
We have been working with trustees to get a better feel for how many accounts are affected by the transitional provisions. Those numbers do seem to have come down since we first asked this question during the Bills Committee last year. Whether that's because the data is better and the trustees are looking at it closer, or because people are actually making choices, we can't disaggregate, to be perfectly honest. Although anecdotally, on the basis of the discussion with the trustees, we don't see that there have been a lot of people who are rushing in to make new choices. So I'd have to say there's not been a surge of people moving out of defaults into something else at this stage. There are two sides of this coin, though, of course. In the one sense, yes, it reduces an administrative issue the more people make choices, but the more people make choices, the fewer will end up in the DIS. So we need to be cautious about this, and we've sent out guidelines or circular letters to the sales forces to tell them to be very careful. Be careful what you're telling people here, because if you go in and give them advice about individual fund choices they should be making, you've got to do suitability assessments. You can't just say, don't invest in the DIS or do invest in the DIS. They have to actually have a basis for making that, having regard to individual circumstances. So we're asking the industry to be very cautious and careful in relation to what they say about that.
跟住係請周浩鼎議員。
唔該主席。其實都有好幾個問題想請教嘅。咁如果我有重複咗，因為頭先行咗出去，咁大家再冇介意。第一個問題呢，我就留意到呢，今次呢個核心基金佢嗰個做呢，佢有60% 係會放喺一啲所謂風險較高嘅投資嗰度嘅。咁我想問下，因為原先我驚我有誤會，我早期聽到呢做嗰個核心基金嘅時候呢，都係因為諗住即係可能俾一啲自己冇選擇嘅，咁就擺落去啦。咁呢個核心基金嚟講呢，會唔會我想睇下佢究竟同一啲而家現行做緊一啲低風險嗰啲基金係點比較嘅呢？即係睇嚟，因為呢個核心基金都擺到成60% 係風險比較高嘅。咁其實我想了解下佢而家同一啲現行緊嘅低風險嘅基金究竟點比較呢？係咪佢已經係最低啊？還是即係當然仲有其他比佢更加仲低呢？最低嘅風險呢？咁第二呢，就係我留意到呢，你哋都話呢，而家呢係可以自己去選擇，即係嗰個人如果揀呢，佢可以自行選擇翻核心累積基金或者65歲後基金，佢可以自己選擇嘅。我想問喺呢個過程，喺呢個情況嚟講呢，嗰個收費係咪都係 bound to lower 定 0.75% 嘅？即係我想肯定下呢樣嘢啫嚇。咁仲有一個問題呢，我就睇到呢，就文件裏面講呢，因為喺17年嘅4月1號之前呢，如果係年滿咗60歲而又冇作投資選擇嘅成員呢，就唔可以轉過嚟今次預設基金嘅。我主要想了解下嗰個理由啊，咁即係我想了解下咁啫。咁同埋咧，就因為另外一個條件咧，就係話如果係本身嗰個成員咧，佢係有一啲做咗一啲保證基金有啲承諾回報，如果佢當然即係參加咗呢個 DIS 之後咧，個回報會低於佢嗰個承諾回報咧，就唔會鼓勵，即係唔會俾佢轉翻嚟。咁呢個我完全明白嘅。不過我想問下係點樣 judge 嘅？係咪你哋本身已經係根據翻本身嗰間銀行可能提供咗俾佢，就知道我哋已經答應咗俾咁多個回報你，所以我哋就唔會俾你轉過去嗰度啦。咁係咪個銀行去決定嘅咧？咁主要係呢幾個問題啫。唔該。
Eddie?
Chairman, let me try to answer those sequentially. The core accumulation fund, yes, is generally riskier than most current defaults. If you look at the current range of defaults, some schemes use the conservative fund, which is much lower risk. That's almost no risk. Some use guarantee, but some also use target date funds, so they've got some equity content exactly in the same way as we have under this proposal. Some use mixed asset funds. But I would concede that on the average, this solution, the core accumulation fund, does take on more risk, but it does so deliberately because part of the consequence of leaving this to trustees' discretion or providers' discretion in the past is they have tended to take the approach, not just here in Hong Kong but elsewhere in the world, that it's the least trouble to them, so that they will face less issues. But that's not necessarily the best result for members. The sort of scenario analysis we did, I referred to in the previous answer, was very much looking at this issue. So what's the consequence at the end of the day after 40 years saving of taking these different approaches? And as a matter of consensus with the industry, academically, and having regard to what's done elsewhere, we think this is the best approach, albeit we take them out of this 60% equity fund from age 50 so that we reduce the prospect of things going very bad towards the end. But yes, this is higher risk than many of the current default approaches. I'd agree with that. In terms of choice, if people choose these two constituent funds, yes, they get the benefit of the fee caps. Even if they're not doing it through the DIS, if they choose the core accumulation fund or the age 65 plus fund, yes, they get the benefit of the 0.75 management fee cap. In terms of the switching, perhaps I didn't describe that very well. Nothing prevents anyone over 65 or anyone in a guarantee fund from switching to the default investment strategy. What I was referring to is the transitional process. So for current accounts, whilst for those affected accounts for people who haven't given instructions at the moment, they will get the letter. If they don't respond, then they'll automatically be moved. That doesn't apply in those two particular cases. So it's only for those transitional accounts. And the reason we didn't do it for those over 60 is we thought it probably not best to move them automatically without they're necessarily doing anything because they're so close to retirement that the investment strategy we've adopted just won't have time to have impact. So we took them out, but they can, and they will be told through the notices we'll give to everyone, that they can make the choice to invest in these if they want.
As long as they provide you with the consent, then it could be transferred.
Yeah, like everyone else, they can.
Fair enough,
the same with the guarantee fund. The concept with the guarantee fund is they're a bit different. We have problems like with these. Well, what's going to happen in the future is one thing, but we've taken the brave decision that we have a default approach for going forward. So, yeah, there'll be winners and losers in that, but we've made that decision. For guarantees, it's a bit different because you've got accrued benefits, you've got accrued rights, and we didn't want to take people out of a guarantee fund where the value of what they've already accrued would be lost. So there's some calculations which are a little complex for the trustees to do in that case, but that's a special case. Again, though, if the member wants to, at any time after 1st of April, they can go into the defaults.
Okay.
就算佢哋係4月1號之前冇轉嘅咧，4月1號之後，只要佢要求都係可以轉嘅。OK， 唔該。咁跟住係請鍾國斌議員。
唔該，主席，有幾個問題想少少澄清嘅啫。第一個問題咧就係喺嗰個slide 度，我在呢個預設投資策略裏邊咧，
第幾頁啊？
第四版應該。佢呢度講嘅咧就係話，修訂條例要求每名受託人須在每個強積金計劃下提供一套高度劃一設收費管制嘅預設投資策略。呢、個高度劃一嘅準則係呢班trustee 佢哋自己坐低傾去落實呢樣嘢啊，定係強積金管理局一齊參與啊，政府一齊參與啊，咁點樣去高度劃一法？嗰個高度劃一法嗰個準則情況係點嘅？呢個第一個問題。第二個問題咧就係嗰個時間表。個時間表就係話4月1號之後咧，即係第16版，即係4月1號之後咧就有60天嘅條例實施起計嘅6個月時間，就通知所有嘅受託人。唔係嗰個成員，咁六個月之後咧就會有42日，42日之後再14日。咁係如果咁係咪60天？即係話368、180日之後再42日，再14日之後，咁佢變咗係2017年年底先真正嘅落實，係咪咁計啊？定係話喺嗰60天之內都包埋呢42、14日咁？咁啊，第三個最後嘅問題就係嗰個違規嘅後果，嗰個後邊有講過罰款，嗰個罰款咧係咪喺條例度已經寫明晒？咁就但係就係由管理局去最終決定，即係真係違規嘅話，就係管理局自己去決定翻你罰幾多，或者係咪釘佢牌之類呢咁嘅嘢。
Darren,
Chairman, let me try to answer those. In terms of the development of the details, that's been a very broad church contributing to that. I outlined at the commencement the process we've been through in developing this. So the public consultation even included many of these investment parameters. So that goes right back to 2014. Even before then, we've been talking to the industry in some detail about how to do this. But we had regard to other things too. The industry didn't get exactly everything they wanted in terms of the investment strategy because, as I said, we used some external consultants from the OECD to do some scenario analysis for us on what was the best investment approach. Ultimately, of course, we came to you. We came to LegCo with these proposals in the bill, and some of those were discussed at length here. So there's been a lot of input into that investment approach. I think the industry certainly agrees as a consensus at the end of the day that it represents the best approach as a default. It's not right for everyone individually, and individuals might want to look at it, does it suit my circumstances, and they may choose something else. But when looking to how to structure for a default, it's consistent with international practice, consistent with the research we've got, and is based on consensus with the industry and indeed, I hope, the legislature, because these were discussed here. In terms of the timetable, which is up at the moment, the way this works is, so what kicks off on the 1st of April is the 6-month transitional period. So within that first 6 months, the trustee has to send these letters to the affected accounts. We're leaving it up to them as to when in that. Some want to do it all at once, some want to spread it out across their membership. Most are inclined to do it earlier rather than later in the 6 months, but they've got 6 months to send that letter out. Once the letter is sent out, the member has 42 days to respond. Only at the end of that 42nd day does the next 14 days kick in. So within the 14 days after the 42nd day, the trustee, if they haven't got a response, has to move that account into the default investment strategy. So if you take the absolute outliers on that simple design, there are a few exceptions to this I'll just come to in a second, but so the latest this could possibly happen in the simple case would be the letter would go out the last day of the 10th month, so the end of October, add 42 days to that for the response period, and within 12 days after that the money would be moved over. So within that time frame, in the normal case, would be the last date that all this transition would be finished. The exceptional cases are there are some special rules in the legislation about cases where there is returned mail because it wasn't received. The trustee has to, in effect, do the process again. So there are some exceptional cases in that, but for the vast majority of affected accounts, which is only a subset of the overall accounts, of course, this will be completed within that 6 months plus 42 days plus 14 days. I haven't actually got the calendar on me, but that is the end of October, mid-November, so by early December 2017. The penalties, yes. The law, like any of the other financial penalty decisions within the law, is left to the discretion of the authority, and any decision about revoking or suspending trustees or their administration of a scheme is, as in other cases, left to the discretion of the authority, albeit subject to the normal review cases. Some of this is subject to a review committee, and all of it will be subject to judicial review as necessary.
Okay. 大家有冇其他問題？嗱，如果冇呢，咁我哋就去睇睇個立法程序嘅時間表。咁正話都講咗，就話生效日期公告就會喺2017年4月1日起呢就實施嘅。咁而家我哋嗰個審議期屆滿日期呢，就係定咗喺11月16號。咁我諗呢個有啲急，因為今日已經11號啦。咁所以呢，就如果大家冇特別意見嘅呢，我就建議就改到去12月7號，因為之後呢，我哋就要向內務委員會提交報告嘅。咁如果係按照12月7號嗰個日期呢，我哋就將會喺11月25號呢，就首先向內會就提交呢個報告，咁就動議修訂呢個附屬法例作出嘅預告期呢，亦都係需要5天嘅，咁變咗嗰度呢，就會去到11月30號嘅嚇。咁大家有冇意見？冇。咁我哋就大家同意就將呢個期限呢，就由11月16號呢，就延展至12月7號啊。咁我諗大致上我哋呢個委員會有關要處理嘅東西呢，都完成咗㗎啦。咁大家認為有冇需要再開會 ？OK， 如果冇嘅呢，咁我諗我哋就係啦，除非有特別事情呢，我哋就呢個會議呢就完結㗎啦。咁我哋就今日嘅會議呢就結束，多謝各位。